The short answer to that question, I'm afraid, is I don't know. That is, there are some elements of mystery there that I frankly acknowledge. If you are looking for a cut and dried response that ties up every loose end, I can't help you. On the other hand, there are some other things to say. One is the fact that however we think about the horrible question of suffering and evil, every conceivable outlook and frame of reference, of philosophy, of worldview, faces something of the same sort of question. For example, supposing you are a philosophical materialist, that is, someone who believes that all there is in the universe is matter, space, time, and energy, nothing else. Everything is finally explainable in terms of bouncing subatomic particles. In that case, it's really difficult to formulate a really sophisticated interpretation of what good and evil really are. The trouble is that the philosophical materialists I know still want to preserve a sense of good and evil. They want to condemn a Pol Pot or a Hitler. There is a universal abhorring of those who bash up and beat babies. There are categories of good and evil that are universal, and we admire the good and self-sacrifice and so forth, and we despise and we are angry with, or we're disappointed at, we're revulsed by that which is evil. In one sense, the very fact that we have categories for good and evil already itself speaks beyond the merely materialist worldview to something that is transcendent, to something that is within us, to something that is within our nature as human beings. But there's more than that. It's not just that good and evil exist. From the Bible's perspective, although God remains sovereign over the whole, He doesn't stand behind good and evil in exactly the same way. He stands behind good in such a way that the good is finally creditable to Him. That is, He uses agencies and means and so forth to bring about good, whereas the evil is regularly assigned under God's sovereignty to second causes, to a Hitler, to a Pol Pot, to the devil himself, to us in our rebellion. Evil is not first and foremost a thing that somebody has created. It's the rebellion of God's image bearers and of other beings that God has created against Him. And perhaps most important of all, what do you do with Jesus? Because the Bible insists that Jesus came along perfectly good and one with God and one with human beings, simultaneously God and a human being. But He chooses, by God's own will and design, to bear the sins of others, including its effects in death and suffering, in Himself on the cross for the sake of others. In other words, the God of the Bible is not merely a distant being in a far-off place who chuckles when evil takes place on the earth and is bored by goodness, some kind of malicious being. Rather, He is the God who comes in the person of His dear Son to actually bear the sin and guilt of His own rebellious people so that they might be forgiven and free. Now, it's possible to talk about these things a long time and push all kinds of philosophical boundaries and think through them more deeply. But in my view, one of the most stabilizing things for Christian faith is simply this. When I don't have all the answers, I return to the cross, and there I see the God-man suffering on my behalf. I can worship and trust a God like that.